Hello everybody, welcome back. Dr. Doyle here, talking to you today about one of my favorite topics in this class, which is infiltration. And I may have mentioned it before, but I really like discussing and learning and teaching about infiltration because once you learn about it, you'll really start to see how we as water resource engineers can start to manipulate the landscapes that we are helping to design in order to maximize infiltration and decrease runoff, which is going to help us tremendously. So just keep that in mind, and hopefully this lesson will help you a little bit with that. We're going to talk about another method used to estimate infiltration, and this method is accepted and recommended by the U.S. government. It is the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Sciences, curve number method. Services, it's natural whatever. I'll put it up here when I'm editing this. NRCS curve number method. And this is really used for runoff, so we're going to continue to talk about this coming up in the next few weeks, but I'm introducing it here because it does relate to infiltration. The NRCS uses an equation that says that runoff is equal to the precipitation, which we've talked about, minus abstractions. That word is a little bit abstract, but really it's trying to capture all of the ways that water doesn't make it to become, or precipitation doesn't make it to become runoff. And so this is a method that is used to combine the effects of soil types, watershed, characteristics, and land use into a single parameter. Okay, and when we talk about abstractions, what they are including in this description is interception. And interception is when rainfall lands on, for example, foliage or leaves. And from there, it doesn't make it into the runoff within the time duration that we look at for a storm. Instead, it usually is evaporated back into the atmosphere at some later time, but we call it interception rather than evaporation. Storage that might occur. This storage can take many different shapes and sizes. The biggest one we can sort of think of as water resource engineers that we may have some control on is rainwater catchment. This is going to include what we're talking about now, which is infiltration. And then it can also include, of course, evapotranspiration, but when we talk about runoff from a particular storm event, the time scale is usually not big enough to really take care too much about it. So I'm just going to highlight this infiltration because that's what we are most interested in for now. Okay, so let's talk more about this mysterious curve number, and it really kind of does feel like a mystery sometimes. Move over here for a minute. Okay, so curve number. We call it CN. And this is just the parameter that has been decided upon by many years of study, many watersheds. So this whole method was derived based on a large number of gauged sites, watersheds throughout the U.S. So that you had gauges available for rainwater input as well as the runoff. So they were able to gauge and measure the inflow and the outflow, and then derive these abstractions from there. And because they've done it for so many watersheds, it's sort of like an average condition based on some parameters that we'll talk about. And so you can apply it to really any watershed in the U.S. So the curve number is a parameter that accounts for all these abstractions. And to use this method, the watershed needs to be derived for each, the curve number needs to be derived for each watershed. And we'll walk through some examples of this because you can have curve numbers for different parts of the watershed and then use sort of an averaging to find one curve number. Once you do this, we can then get an equation for our Q, our runoff, and this is going to be P minus IA squared divided by P minus IA plus S. Q is runoff. P is the input, the precipitation from the particular event. IA is the initial abstraction that occurs. So this is going to be a lot of that interception and storage that occurs. And then S is a maximum amount of retention that might occur. All of these parameters are measured in inches or millimeters. And so our flow and our precipitation, all of these are going to be basically the depth over the watershed. So we're going to convert, just like we did when we did conservation of mass, everything into a depth over the watershed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more. Let me highlight this equation. It is an important one. We'll come back to it in a week or so when we talk a little bit more about runoff. Let's talk a little bit more about these initial abstractions. This is all losses that occur before runoff. And again, from all of these measurements that they did, there's an estimate that IA, the initial abstractions, is equal to 0.2 times S, so 20% of your maximum retention available. And so if you do that, you're going to get Q is equal to P minus 0.2 S squared divided by P plus 0.8 S. Okay, so this is the equation that we will use moving forward. Again, this is more for runoff, which we're going to come back to in a couple weeks. But what's important here is you haven't seen anywhere this curve number come in, but it is used to calculate S. And so S is equal to 1,000 divided by the curve number minus 10. And so let's talk a little bit about this curve number. This curve number is going to be any number, going to range from 0 to 100. And you'll see here, I'm going to pop it up right here. Let's see if that works, if I can get that to work. That this figure here shows the curve number. What does it show? I had it written down. It's giving you, for a particular rainfall event, the precipitation, how much runoff you'll get for different curve numbers. And what you'll notice from this is that as you increase your curve number, you get more runoff. When there's more runoff, that should be a signal to you that there's less infiltration. Okay, and we haven't touched on this yet, but I want you to start thinking about where that runoff goes and where it needs to go, right? and imagining that if we could keep more of the water, to infiltrate, then we can decrease our runoff. So ranges from 0 to 100. Here's just a couple of examples to keep in mind. So if you looked at a parking lot, the curve number would be about 80. Okay, so that's on the high end, which, as you probably can realize, pretty impervious surface, except for certain areas where there might be vegetation, and so there's not a lot of infiltration happening. On the other hand, a golf course, which are usually upkept very well, these have a curve number of about 40. Okay, lower curve number, not a ton of runoff happening, lots of potential for infiltration. Okay, so to summarize some of that, the higher your curve number is, this is going to suggest less infiltration and more runoff. Okay, so higher curve number is going to mean less infiltration, more runoff, and then thinking about where all that runoff is going to go. All right, so know a little bit now about the NRCS curve number method. I'm going to talk briefly as I possibly can, about the topic that I really am interested in, about some of these factors to determine what this curve number. So again, remember, the curve number is just this parameter that takes into account the watershed conditions in order to help us to estimate really how much water can be infiltrated into that particular watershed. Okay, so I'm going to talk real quick, and you're going to see some images popping up here, hopefully not covering my face. I'm going to do my best here. It takes a lot of planning to make these videos, but okay. I'm going to talk about 4 different characteristics of the watershed that are taken into account in determining the curve number. And they are the hydrologic soil group. Maybe this is a term that is familiar to you from a soil mechanics class. Okay, that's number 1. The next one is going to be land cover. This is going to be considering the type of vegetation you have. Next one is going to be hydrologic conditions. This one is, to me, the most ambiguous. And then lastly, antecedent runoff conditions. It's a great word. Okay, so let's go through each of these quickly. Whenever just an abbreviation for conditions. It's hard to write in that. Okay, anyway, I'm babbling. All right, 4 different soil groups, conveniently labeled A, B, C, and D. Soil group A is sand and gravel. Easy. Soil group B is moderately grained soil, sand, and soil. Group C is a clay loam up to pretty loose clay. And then D is clay. Okay, what does this mean for infiltration? The sand and gravel, these have high infiltration. So think about going to the beach, right? You pour water on the sand, building your lovely sand castles, it soaks right in. Not a lot of ponding happens. You just lose all that water. High infiltration. Group B has moderate infiltration. C has low infiltration. And then these hard clays have very low infiltration. This is the type of soil that is common in Santa Clara County, Santa Clara Valley. So go in your yard if you happen to be in Santa Clara County and pour water on it, see what happens. A lot of times in my yard, it just ponds. It does not infiltrate very easily. Okay, there you go. Hydrologic soil groups. There are tons of maps available to help you define soil groups for really anywhere, or you can do a soil analysis to figure this out. So land cover. This is the vegetation type. And as an example, you're going to look up and see things like fallow, meaning that this is like a field that they've left to just kind of go fallow, which they're not growing anything on it, they're not tilling it, it's just left. Maybe some weeds are growing and then dying. So there's fallow. There's I'm just mentioning a few here. There's row crops, and so knowing that it's row crops means that there's like very distinct places where there are crops growing, and then there's bare soil exposed between them. You might have a grassland, and a grassland is usually either mowed or allowed for grazing, which means that the height of the grass is managed a bit, or you might have a meadow. And meadows or forest, and these are more wild lands, right? And so a lot of more interception happens as you move down versus just exposed soil. And so the type of vegetation type is going to impact interception, as well as the condition that it's in is going to allow you to say whether or not infiltration can happen. And then you can have a row crop in a type C soil or a B soil. So you can see how this starts becoming like a puzzle. Maybe that's why I like it so much. Okay, hydrologic condition: poor, fair, or good. Okay, and this is an attempt to measure how good or bad the soil and vegetation combination in a particular watershed or area is at allowing infiltration. It's possible to increase the conditions from poor to fair to good, which is again another way that we can manipulate here as part of the water cycle. Of course, well, maybe not of course, but if you can get to this good, as the name implies, that's good. We want to get there. That's going to get us higher infiltration. Why is infiltration so good? I've kind of mentioned that it's going to help us reduce runoff, but another thing is, where does that water end up? It ends up in one of our best reservoirs, which is groundwater, right? Groundwater is protected from evaporation, and so if we can get the water there, we're in good shape. Okay, last we have the antecedent runoff conditions. This really means what are the conditions like from before this particular storm comes. And this is because the curve number changes depending on the length of time since the last storm. And you've probably experienced and witnessed this on your own, come October, November, when it begins to rain in Northern California. The soil conditions are different than they are even now in March, right? So you usually have three conditions: condition 1, condition 2, and condition 3. And in condition 1, the soil is really dry. So this is actually can cause a decrease in infiltration when that top layer is really dry. Kind of gets cakey and it's harder for the water to infiltrate. Condition 2 is average conditions, kind of what you want. And then condition 3 is when there's been recent heavy rainfalls, and this can start to decrease infiltration as well, because there's just not the capacity for the soil. Okay. That was just like perfect timing. All right, so these are the 4 conditions. They're going to lead to these tables that are available for you in the NRCS, which have been popping up here in the NRCS documents, and those will help you to pick your curve numbers. And we're going to again run through some examples in class of working through using these tables. All right, there you go. Estimating infiltration using the NRCS curve number method. And we're going to again come back to this to bring it all the way to flow. Thanks, y'all.